Hello, it's Jeff, your neighborhood-friendly historian, and I just wanted to make sure that you remember that economics are a complete contrivance. There is absolutely no natural precedent for any type of economic system or economic function whatsoever. We have behavioral information and data that inform the way that we project economy or economic functions will work going into the future, and we can use it to reconstruct some of the human-sided explanations for things that have happened in the past. But at the end of the day, money doesn't exist. And even when there was a standard of a physical, tactile, tangible thing that you could base money on, like gold, it was completely arbitrary. Now, why was gold selected? It's a pretty interesting question. Well, it seems that unlike the Spartans, who under Lycurgus were the ones who decided, hey, we should use iron for currency because it's big and heavy and it'll make us not want to acquire wealth, there was limited access to the resource. And so gold provided a way for the people who wanted to run the economy to ensure they were the only people who could extract it. And when you see that any economic function is ultimately a derivative of that, at least any of the systems that we use, it's pretty edifying that from the beginning, some people wanted to have money and they wanted to make sure that other people didn't have it. Now, how those lines were broken up over time has changed, and the cultural perceptions surrounding them as to who decided who had what or who would have access to what. But what we see today, where there is an ever-decreasing number of people possessing an ever-increasing amount of wealth, is unsustainable. And what we used to call table scrap economics, which later got referred to as trickle-down economics under Reagan, none of those functions actually exist. And we know that because the dragon hoard amounts of wealth that billionaires have now are just, they wouldn't be increasing if those amounts of money were being earnestly invested the way that everybody says they would be, being reinvested into whatever the economic sphere at the macro level is that would be able to sustain or to develop. And when you compare the amounts of money that were lost to the average person during events like COVID and the amount of money gained by the people who stood to gain it, who are the large corporations, when you see that, and you see how comparable the amounts of money are, it makes you say, what's going on here? And there are a lot of people who are politically divided right now when they really should be divided along economic means. Because if you're poor, or if you're not making enough money to survive comfortably right now, it's not because the other poor people or the other uncomfortable people to your left and right are causing that suffering. And I know it's really hard for a lot of people to understand that because they have political and emotional inclinations to believe that there's some semblance of truth to the quote-unquote American dream. But that dream, just as every other democratic and Republican ideal that we've been handed from ancient times, were concoctions. And I myself am an ancient historian, and I can tell you that the quote-unquote democracy of the Athenians was definitely not what they purported it to be. And the imperial nature of the Athenian policies at the time of, say, the Peloponnesian War, and the cultural belief on both the sides of the Spartans and the Athenians that war was inevitable, led to the war. And so we see a lot of rhetoric coming from a lot of different places right now that are pointing inexorably towards a war. And it's creating sympathies against other people who were pretending are ideologically aligned in a polar opposite from our own perspective when they're really not. At the end of the day, there's a small group of people with a lot of access to wealth and power who is manipulating a much larger population that doesn't have that access. And that's been happening for thousands of years. It's just that now the technological piece of this equation can end all life on Earth. Let me say that again. The technological capacity of any of these countries who are now just bandying about talking about war can end all life on Earth, except for the people who live in bunkers, most of whom are also themselves filthy rich. So, as much as I'm not one to buy into conspiracy theories because they're usually unbacked, a conspiracy theory is a conspiracy theory until it's no longer a theory. And a giant war to erupt between, whatever polarization or politicization of quote-unquote East and West would be catastrophic for the planet. Not that any of those people care, because they wouldn't be immediately affected because they have the means to be able to get out of the circumstances that they themselves will create. So, if you want change, I am not an advocate for violent revolution. I'm an advocate for peaceful resolution. But what we need to do in this country and a lot of the countries around the world is tell the people who have the power that we're not going to let them exercise it unscrupulously anymore. You should vote no confidence in every single election that comes up for the next 4 years. Every position, every single election. Because none of the people who quote-unquote profess to serve us are doing that. They're lining their pockets. The fact that the people who run the purse strings of the government are increasing their own pay to the detriment of the deficit of the United States particularly is indicative of just how little they care about quote-unquote economics, because they don't believe in them. When you have the access to the vast majority of the wealth, you don't care. So, no confidence votes up and down the ladder, no matter how small or inconsequential you believe the position to be. We should vote no confidence in every single election, because none of these politicians adhere to the ideologies that they profess when they're giving their demagogic speeches from the top of, their golden temples. None of them care. Nobody cares about what people consider conservatism and liberalism in America anymore. Well, nobody that has power does. Only the people who still believe in these dead ideologies are the ones who still try to vote along party lines, which, if you can't tell by recent events in the last couple of presidential elections, lest I digress. Vote no confidence, because we need change, and change is not going to come from the people who have power right now. I wish I had the individual courage or the lack of skeletons in my closet that I could go and run for office, but I can't. But what I can tell you is that having, a little bit of education in particularly American government and in history and in ancient history, I know where politics and economic systems come from, and they don't come from good places, and they definitely, as evidenced by recent history, they definitely don't lead to good places. So please consider this my plea that we just start voting no confidence for every single position. Violence is abhorrent and terrible in every capacity. If you've never experienced good, I'm glad, but if you think you want it, you don't. Instead, use the political systems, the paltry remaining political systems we have, to go ahead and realign the government so that it reflects actual American values, which are not the ones that are being demonstrated by any of our current seated politicians. Thank you for listening to my TED Talk. My name is Jeffrey U-Hall. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments.